The wind is screaming at 60 miles an hour. The temperature has dropped to 29 below zero. And somewhere out there, buried in a wall of white, a rope goes slack in a woman's hands. No sound. No shout. Just nothing. That's where this story starts. Stay with it, because you won't believe how it ends. Late September, 1887. A man named Callum Ashgrove pushed a battered handcart across the frozen edge of Ashford Valley. 39 years old, but the road had aged him 20 years past that. His coat was stitched from 2 different kinds of fabric. In one arm, he carried his 10-month-old daughter, Ivy, against his shoulder. Beside the cart walked his 7-year-old son, Sam, who hadn't asked how much farther in 3 days. Callum used to travel with repair crews, fixing barns and pumps and wagon wheels along the rail lines. That ended the day his wife, Clara, died from a fever after childbirth. A man can't chase work across the territory with a baby on his hip and a grieving boy trailing behind him. So he chased shelter instead. Any shelter. 3 ranches had already turned him away. One wanted his labor but not his children. One gave him a single night's floor and pointed him back to the road by morning. One suggested it might be kinder to give Ivy to another family who could actually feed her. Callum said nothing. He just picked up the cart handle and kept walking. The night before they reached the next ranch, Ivy would only settle after a few spoonfuls of watery porridge. Sam took half of his own cornbread and hid it inside his coat. Not because he was still hungry. Because he no longer believed there would be food tomorrow. That proof of tomorrow appeared the next morning, past a ridge scoured bare by wind. A ranch called Stonebrick Hollow. The barn roof sagged. The main doors faced dead into the wind. A row of half-dead willow trees leaned too close to the buildings. Smoke poured sideways out of the chimney. But inside the corral, the milk cows were still standing. By the water trough stood a woman named Wren Calloway, breaking a sheet of ice off the trough with the back of a hammer, weeks before the season should have allowed ice to form at all. She looked at the stranger, then at the 2 children, and asked one question. "What kind of work do you know?" "Barn frames," Callum said. "Hand pumps. Water lines. Wagon wheels. Roofs. Doors. Hay storage." Then he asked her his own question. "What do you need?" His eyes drifted to Ivy, chewing the edge of her blanket, no longer crying, because hunger had outlasted tears days ago. "Give my children milk," he said. "Let us sleep somewhere the wind can't reach. I'll fix whatever winter is about to break." Wren crossed her arms. "What makes you think anything's broken?" Callum pointed at her buildings. "Your doors face the wrong wind. Your hay's pulling damp straight out of the ground. That water line will freeze before the first real cold snap even hits." Wren studied him a long moment, studied the children even longer, and without answering a single one of his claims, stepped forward and lifted Ivy right out of his arms. "The milk comes first," she said. "Your claims can wait until morning." Inside her kitchen, she warmed cow's milk and tested it against her wrist, then nodded at Callum to eat. He said he wasn't hungry. She set a bowl of stew in front of him anyway. Sam ate in silence, and when he thought no one was watching, slipped his leftover cornbread into his pocket again. Wren saw it. She said nothing. She just quietly set another piece of bread beside his bowl, like it had always been there. Over the last bites of the meal, they traded only the facts that mattered. Clara had died 6 months earlier. Wren's husband, Ezra, had been killed 3 winters before that, crushed when a logging wagon slid off an icy mountain road. Wren had never had children. Stonebrick Hollow was drowning in debt after losing 9 cattle the winter before. Later, Wren climbed into the storage loft and brought down an old wooden cradle her husband had started building years earlier and never finished. One rail was still rough, unsanded. She could have burned it for kindling 100 times over. She hadn't. That night, Ivy slept in that cradle for the first time. Sam fell asleep with his hand still curled around the bread in his pocket. Before sunrise, Callum was already out walking the property. He didn't touch a single tool that first morning. He just watched. He tied a scrap of wool near the barn door and watched the wind curl through the gap. He dug into the hay pile and found the bottom layer soaked with damp. He poured water into the trough and timed how sluggishly it drained. Inside the house, frost crept along shrinking gaps between the log walls. Wren followed a few steps behind, saying nothing. When Callum finally spoke, he pointed instead of waving his arms. The barn's not losing heat because the walls are thin. It's losing heat because the wind walks straight through your doors. He knelt at the hay. This is spoiling from the bottom up. He nodded at the pump. That line's too shallow. It's got nowhere to drain. His palm rested on the log wall. The chinking's pulled away here. And last, he looked at the dying willow row. Those trees are in the wrong spot for winter. Wren folded her arms. My husband planted those. He wasn't wrong when he planted them, Callum said. The wind that matters in winter comes from a different direction than the wind that matters in spring. The trees never moved. The season did. Something in her face softened, the way ice softens right before it cracks. He laid out his plan. 6 weeks. Water first, then hay, then the windbreak, then the barn entrance, then the wall seals, then marker posts, all before the first real storm hit. Wren pointed toward the tool shed. You get 1 week. Then I decide whether you actually see problems, or whether you just invented some to earn a bet. The work began. First the hay. They pulled the soggy bottom layers off the stack, and the sour smell rose up. Callum built a raised crib from old pine rails, splitting the hay into sections with air gaps between them. Sam's job was measuring the gaps, 8 inches, always 8 inches, counting each one out loud. It was the most words he'd spoken since they arrived. Next, the water line. Callum found a pipe buried barely 2 feet down when it needed to sit closer to 5. We don't have time to redo the whole line, Wren said. Then we don't, Callum answered. We protect the stretch between the well and the cows first. That afternoon, an old neighbor named Agnes Hollis stopped by with fresh goat's milk and news. Deacon Marsh has been asking about your new man, she said to Wren. Nobody answered. But when Agnes noticed the bread peeking out of Sam's pocket, she quietly asked if she should leave an extra loaf. Wren shook her head. Leave too. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of a new windbreak, 34 feet from the barn, L-shaped, tall enough to slow the wind without letting the snow pile against it. That's when a horse stopped at the fence, and Deacon Marsh climbed down without a greeting. Deacon owned the biggest spread in the valley, and he'd wanted to buy Stonebrick Hollow ever since Ezra died. Wren had refused him. He looked over the half-built frame and smirked. So this is the drifter's willow wall. All it's gonna do is trap snow and bury your barn. If I build it too close, you're right, Callum said, hands steady on the post driver. Deacon frowned. But distance matters more than the wall does. Deacon turned to Wren. Since when does a drifter get to play engineer around here? Wren didn't glance away from her survey stakes. He's not a drifter. He's my foreman, until the work proves otherwise. Deacon let out a short laugh and rode off, muttering that winter would decide who was wasting their time. Sam watched the horse disappear over the ridge. What if he's right? Callum picked up the next willow pole. Then we fix it before the snow does. The first real test came sooner than expected. A hard squall rolled in, and Callum had tied strips of cloth to the willow posts beforehand, to watch exactly how the wind moved through the structure. Within minutes he had his answer. The middle of the windbreak was woven too tight. The wind climbed over it, dropped back down, and slammed the ground right behind the wall, kicking snow toward the barn door. One panel snapped clean off its post. An old cow spooked at the gap and nearly ripped a hinge loose. Callum grabbed the willow and cut away almost a fifth of the middle section. Wren watched the cloth strips flutter. Weave the next sections on a diagonal. Let the wind spread out instead of slamming into one flat wall. They worked until dark, and when the next gust hit, it passed through the willow, lost its force, and never reached the barn. A week later, the county livestock inspector, Thomas Reed, rode in. He didn't laugh at any of it. Instead, he asked the hard questions. A barn sealed too tight traps moisture. Deep bedding builds up dangerous fumes. A hay crib packed wrong can heat itself and catch. A homemade water line can pull dirt straight back into the trough. Callum listened without interrupting, and together they checked every vent, every inch of bedding, every seam in the haystack. Before he left, Thomas made one request. Keep records. Morning and evening temperatures. Firewood burned. Hay used. Every time the trough needed breaking. Wren hung a ledger by the kitchen door. Then Winter tested them without waiting. The first batch of chinking Callum mixed for the log walls failed after 2 cold nights, shrinking away and leaving gaps the wind slipped straight through. He reached for his scraper, ready to start over. Wren stopped him. My father used to seal sheep sheds. Less clay. More animal hair, more rice straw. Scratch the first layer before you finish the second. They mixed a new batch her way, and it gripped the logs instead of pulling away. Later, digging through the loft, Callum found an old canvas roll, stitching still intact. Clara made this, he said. We used it as a draft curtain, back on the rail line. He hung it between the sleeping rooms, and while they worked, he talked about Clara for the first time, how she never feared the cold but always checked a child's wrist before the fire. Wren answered with her own memory, how Ezra used to set 2 tin cups by the stove every morning. The next morning, 2 cups sat there again. Neither of them said why. Life at Stonebrook Hollow found a rhythm. Callum worked outside from dawn to dark. Wren cared for Ivy, warming milk, changing blankets, learning the difference between a cry for warmth and a cry for food. At first she held the baby stiffly. Then, slowly, she didn't. Ivy started reaching for the collar of Wren's coat. More than once, Callum walked in to find the baby asleep on Wren's shoulder while she balanced a pencil in her free hand, still working the ledger one-handed rather than wake her. One afternoon, shelling beans, Sam looked up. Why don't you have kids? Wren smiled without looking up. Some rooms get built and never get filled. Sam glanced toward the cradle where Ivy was sleeping. That one's filled now. She didn't answer. But the next morning, the leftover cornbread sat untouched on the table. For the first time since Clara died, Sam had gone to sleep trusting there'd be food tomorrow. Then the cold snap hit, 12 degrees above zero by sunrise. The barn, which used to sit around 19 degrees with drafts running the floor all day, now held steady between 30 and 33. The house burned 2 fewer armloads of wood a day. The hay stayed dry and sweet-smelling instead of sour. And then the water stopped. The buried line held, but the metal coupling by the trough froze solid. Callum broke the ice with an axe. I missed it. Together, he and Wren rebuilt the joint, boxed it in wool waste and tarred cloth, and worked until nearly midnight. Wren brought out 2 mugs of hot chicory coffee. I said I'd fix this ranch, Callum muttered. The water still froze. Wren blew across her mug. You promised to fix it. You never promised to get it right on the first try. By morning, the trough filled and drained exactly as planned. For 3 straight weeks, the ledger filled up one careful line at a time. And the numbers built their own quiet argument. 2 fewer armloads of wood burned on cold days. Hay use down nearly 20%. Milk production steady. The trough hadn't frozen once since the fix. When Thomas came back and read every page, he said, I wouldn't call it proven yet. But it's doing exactly what it should. That same afternoon, Deacon Marsh rode in with an ultimatum. Sign over the spring water rights, or lose access to his freight road once the snow came. Wren said no without hesitation. Deacon shrugged. A few cold nights aren't winter. After he left, Callum asked one question. How many days of hay do we have if his road stays closed? 19, by the old numbers, Wren said. Longer if the ledger's right. Callum looked at the darkening sky. We prepare for 26. Wren wrote 26 at the bottom of the ledger and drew a hard line under it. 3 days before the storm, the sky sent its warnings. The cattle turned their backs to the wind and stopped grazing. The air went heavy and still. The birds vanished. By sunset, even the wind itself had died down. Callum and Wren stopped talking about improvements and shifted straight into survival. Marker posts went into the ground every 18 feet. The cistern was topped off. Hay was pulled in close but kept properly ventilated. Every rope on the windbreak was double-checked. Extra lanterns were hung. A guide rope was strung between the house and the barn. Sam watched his father hammer in the last post. Why do we need both the rope and the posts? Callum tied off the final knot. A rope keeps a man from drifting too far. Posts tell him whether he's still heading somewhere. Digging through the shed, Wren found an old stake with her late husband's hand-carved mark and placed it as the first post nearest the house. Callum reinforced the emergency repair bag with a leather strap Clara had sewn years earlier. That evening, Agnes Hollis stopped by one last time on her way to safer ground. Her eyes lingered on the 2 tin cups by the stove, but she said nothing. Near dark, a written warning arrived from Thomas Reed. An Arctic front, gusts over 60 miles an hour, and once the snow started, nobody was to leave shelter for any reason. The storm hit before dawn, coming from exactly the direction Callum had predicted. The windbreak bent hard but held its ground. Snow piled up exactly where it was supposed to. The offset entrance broke the worst of the wind before it touched the cattle. The trough filled and drained before the pipe could freeze. Behind Clara's canvas curtain, the children's room held its warmth. Callum and Wren moved between the house and barn clipped to the guide rope, one trip at a time. By midday, one marker post had already vanished under drifting snow. The next one still had its cloth strip fluttering above the surface. Late that afternoon, a dull pounding sound came from beyond the windbreak. Callum followed the line of posts out into the white blur and found Jesse Colt, one of Deacon Marsh's hands, half buried in the snow beside a marker post. His horse was gone. His cheeks had gone white with frostbite. He'd lost the rest of his crew hours earlier. I saw the cloth, Jesse whispered. That's why I kept walking. Callum got him inside without another word. When Jesse came around by the stove, he had news that chilled the room worse than the storm outside. Deacon's north barn had wind ripping straight through it, cattle packed into one corner, still trying to reach water. Nobody said anything. Jesse looked up at the canvas curtain, the same setup he'd mocked days earlier. Now it had carried him home alive. The storm tightened its grip overnight. Then Maple, the oldest milk cow, went into labor weeks early. Wren knew instantly something was wrong. The calf was turned. No vet could reach the ranch, the roads were buried. So Wren washed her hands in warm water, tied back Maple's tail, found the calf's front legs, and worked the birthing straps by memory. Sam held the lantern, hands shaking. "Watch her eyes," Wren told him, and he did. Callum returned just as the final pull was needed. The calf slid out onto the straw and didn't breathe. Wren cleared its mouth. Callum rubbed its ribs briskly with clean straw. Sam, without being asked, pressed a dry towel into Wren's hand. For one long, frozen second, nothing happened at all. Then the calf drew its first breath. On the third day, the wind hit its hardest peak. One lashing on the windbreak snapped violently. If that panel gave way, wind would tear straight through and could seal the barn shut with snow. Callum grabbed the rope. Wren caught the other end without a word. He crawled post to post through a storm that erased everything past arm's length. One post had already snapped clean off. The loose willow panel slammed into him and knocked him flat. His tool bag burst open, tools scattering across the snow, saved only by Clara's old leather strap. Inside, Maple bellowed. Ivy cried. Wren gripped the rope with both hands until she felt 3 sharp tugs, the signal for more slack. She fed it out. Callum reached the broken section, braced it with a spare pole, just enough to hold until morning. When the rope finally went still, Wren pulled, and the shape crawled back out of the whiteout on one arm and one knee. "It'll hold till morning," Callum said, pushing himself upright. Wren looked past him at the storm still howling. Morning's enough. By the 4th morning, the wind finally loosened its grip. Nobody celebrated right away. They started counting. Every animal was alive. The newborn calf had only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The bedding was dry. Water still flowed. The doors opened without needing to be dug out. There was still firewood by the stove. Jesse stood on his own 2 feet again. Callum walked the ranch with a notebook instead of relief. One brace had been too light. 2 posts needed to sit deeper. The cloth needed stronger stitching. Wren watched him writing. "You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived." Callum closed the notebook. "The living can wait an hour. A weakness shouldn't get to hide behind a success." When the roads opened, people came to Stonebrick Hollow for answers. Thomas Reed arrived first and inspected everything before finally closing his notebook. The barn stayed drier. The herd burned less feed than expected. Stable water made the difference. And every flaw you found early got corrected before the storm ever showed up. Jesse spoke next. "I'd be dead without those marker posts." And last came Deacon Marsh, whose own ranch had lost cattle and part of a roof. He didn't apologize. He just looked at the windbreak and asked how far Callum had set it back and how tightly he'd woven it. Callum told him. Deacon nodded once. "Show me." And they walked across the snow together, no more words needed. Later that day, Wren brought Callum into the ranch office and slid a folded agreement across the desk. It gave him a real share in the ranch, authority over the water systems, the structures, the winter planning. One line stood apart from all the rest. Sam and Ivy would always have a home at Stonebrick Hollow, no matter what happened between the 2 adults. Callum looked up. "Why give me part of something that was always yours?" Wren didn't hesitate. "I'm not giving you what was mine. I'm naming what you already carried." That night, by the stove, Callum looked into his cup. "I came here asking for milk. I never meant to owe you a life." Wren wrapped both hands around her coffee. "You don't owe me one. But there's a life here, if you're willing to share it." Callum smiled, his first real smile in months. I'll stay till the snow's gone. Wren glanced at the ice still clinging to the fence. Stay till the grass comes back. He looked at her. Longer than that. They didn't rush into marriage. The work still came first. They spent the following weeks rebuilding the windbreak stronger than before, and soon even Deacon Marsh's own ranch had adopted the same winter plan. In early May, they held a quiet wedding, witnessed only by the doctor and the inspector, cut short because Maple was calving again. A few days later, Sam looked up from the ledger. Do I have to call you something else now? Wren smiled. You never have to call me anything you don't truly mean. He nodded and kept writing her name. But weeks later, tripping near the marker posts, he blurted out, Ma, and caught himself halfway through. Wren rushed over to brush the dirt off his hands, pretending she hadn't heard it. He'd almost finished the word. As spring settled in, baby Ivy took her first unsteady steps across the yard toward Wren. One tiny word drifted across the open ground. Ma. Wren didn't rush to meet her. She knelt down, right where she was, and waited for the little girl to cover that last stretch of ground on her own 2 feet. Stonebrook Hollow didn't survive because the storm went easy on them. It hit exactly as hard as it was always going to hit. It survived because every weak spot got found and fixed before the storm ever got the chance to use it. If this story hit you, tell me in the comments which part hit hardest, the rope going slack, the calf that wouldn't breathe, or that line about the living being able to wait an hour. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.